Aisha grew up in a modest world, but rich in values and dreams. His apartment was small, a two-room apartment in a working-class neighborhood in the suburbs, where the noise of the city mixed with the voices of neighbors and the bursts of laughter of children playing in the street. There was a simple, familiar warmth to this place, a life full of little things that, in the eyes of others, had no value. But for Aisha, these memories were more precious than all the gold in the world. The kitchen still smelled of Sunday stew, and the walls were covered with black and white photographs, testimonies of a bygone era when her father, with his eyes shining with talent, made his children dream. His father, Ibrahim, was a complex man. An artist at heart, he had been a brilliant musician in his youth, but his dreams of a musical career were shattered by the obstacles of reality. Society, often cruel to those who did not have the right contacts or the money to make their mark, had pushed him to abandon his passion in order to survive. He had tried teaching music, playing in bars, but none of it was enough. Every evening, he came home with an air of resignation, but his daughter knew that music remained his great love. Aisha knew that her father was a man of raw intelligence, capable of captivating crowds with his compositions. But life, in the absence of opportunities and support, had robbed him of the chance to shine. Her mother, Sophie, was a dedicated nurse. She had sacrificed her dreams of traveling, of discovering the world, to raise her children in a modest but warm house. Sophie was the embodiment of patience and generosity, her gentle and reassuring gaze always ready to calm the storms of life. She had taught Aisha the value of hard work, sacrifice and, above all, dignity. Although their situation was far from easy, Aisha had never lacked for anything. His mother had passed on to him this conviction that, despite hardships, one could always find a way to rise, to move forward, to dream. And Aisha, a little girl fascinated by the melodies that floated in the air, had inherited this dream. She aspired to become a musician, to let her fingers glide over the piano keys with the same ease as birds flew in the sky. But the reality was more difficult to accept. Every day, Aisha saw her parents struggling to make ends meet, to offer their children a little more than they had themselves. She knew she had to take control of her destiny. But his dream of making a living from music, of performing on big stages, always seemed out of reach. Music lessons were expensive, auditions reserved for those with connections. And Aisha only had her dreams and her piano, this old upright piano which had belonged to her grandmother and which she had learned to play alone, with the perseverance of great but often invisible souls. This is how she found herself working as a waitress at the restaurant Le Marais, an upscale establishment where the marble walls and glittering chandeliers were a stark contrast to the humility of her daily life. The restaurant was a temple of luxury, a place where the rich and powerful went to impress, to settle into a world where money opened all doors. The servers were invisible. They were there only to satisfy the desires of customers, to hide behind polite smiles and gracious gestures. Aisha, with her natural calm and discreet beauty, blended in perfectly with this decor. She was never loud or annoying. She had learned to make every movement fluid, every word measured. A glass of water served with a smile, a dish delicately placed on the table, and then she disappeared into the shadows of this world that she knew well but to which she did not belong. She was a soul among others, a black woman in a place where you never saw those who weren't supposed to be there. The restaurant was a silent scene, and Aisha was an invisible actress. That evening, however, something was going to happen. As she approached a back table to place a bottle of wine, her eyes met those of Mark Dufresne, a man in his 40s, perfectly dressed in a dark suit that exuded power and authority. Mark was not the type of man to go unnoticed. He had this cold charisma, this imposing presence that attracted attention, but with a marked indifference to others. His gestures were calculated, his looks measured, and he exuded an aura of superiority that nothing seemed to disturb. Mark often came to this type of restaurant, not to savor the refined dishes, but to show off his wealth and test the world around him. He had a habit of provoking, of testing the limits of others, of seeing how far he could push those who, in his opinion, were there to serve him. That evening, his gaze stopped on Aisha. She walked by with a bottle of wine, her movements fluid and precise, and he saw her as an easy target. He stood up suddenly, interrupting the conversation with his table companions, and said in a loud voice,
You, the waitress, why don't you play the piano for us? Show us your talents.
Or do you not have the money to pay for this kind of hobby? The silence that fell around Mark's table was heavy, almost palpable. Everyone's eyes were fixed on Aisha, and for a split second she felt trapped, like a bird in a golden cage. Mark, his mocking smile still hanging on his lips, looked at her with a sort of amused disdain, convinced that he had just put her in a situation where she would decompose, lower her head and accept humiliation. But Aisha did not do what he expected. She was used to being ignored, even belittled. In her work, she was often just a silhouette in the background, hidden among the servants of this world of luxury. She was not rich enough, not influential enough, not visible enough to exist in the eyes of those who thought that everything in life was a question of status. But this evening, with all eyes fixed on her, she felt that a part of her, that she had always hidden, was waking up. Mark persisted, in a more insistent, more cruel tone.
Come on, don't be shy.
You're here to serve, right? Serve us some culture too. He leaned forward, a sneer shaking his chest.
The murmurs around the table grew louder.
Some seemed amused by the scene, while others just glanced furtively, as if this humiliation made them feel superior. A man at the table even took out his cell phone, ready to capture the humiliation of this black woman who had the audacity to be present in this prestigious place.
Suddenly, Aisha felt an intense cold invade her limbs.
The world around her faded slightly, leaving only her and the raw feeling of the injustice she had just suffered. This wasn't just a simple mockery. It was a stark reminder of what she was supposed to be in the eyes of this man and the society around him. A waitress, an insignificant figure. But in this humiliation, something even deeper awoke in her, a strength she didn't know she had. This little voice, that of his father, arises in his mind.
Never let someone turn you off.
These words that he had often said to her, his granddaughter, resonated with a power she had never known. She was not what Mark thought. She was not what he had wanted to make her. She was more than that. A slight tremor shook her fingers, but she took a deep breath. Tears of shame, anger and frustration mixed in her stomach, but she controlled them. It was too late to turn back. She no longer had a choice. Every look that landed on her, every snicker that escaped the table, every whisper became a silent motivation for her action. If she were to serve, then she would serve the only thing that was truly hers, her music. That evening, it was no longer a simple piano piece that she was going to play. It was his soul, his story, his rebellion. It was the truth she had never dared to express. It was his moment. She finally turned, slowly, towards the black lacquered piano in the corner of the restaurant, like a silent monument in the middle of the opulent decor. This piano seemed to belong to another world, a world where music had a place, where beauty had its own legitimacy, far from superficial judgments. Aisha approached it with a calm, almost solemn step. His heart beat harder with every movement. The audience around her seemed suspended in expectation, but Aisha no longer saw them. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the coldness of the keys settle beneath her fingers. A shiver of apprehension ran through her skin, but she had no right to fail. The first keys of the piano resonated in the room, a little hesitant, like a timid attempt to emerge from a darkness that had been nourished for too long. The melody, initially fragile, blossomed as his fingers took possession of the keys. It was not a simple cover of a well-known piece, nor a piece popular in bourgeois salons. No, what she played was her own language, a musical language born of her struggles, of her broken dreams, but also of her immense hope. It was a piece that she had composed years ago, in secret, out of sight, in the solitude of her small apartment. She had written it for herself, to exorcise her demons and ease her sorrows. But tonight, in this restaurant, in front of Mark, the customers and the cameras, this piece had become a declaration of his existence, of his humanity. The first notes were full of sweetness, almost ethereal, then the music thickened, intensifying with more powerful, more assertive chords. Each note was a thought, each silence a breath, each crescendo an explosion. The customers around Mark's table were instantly silent. Mark's chuckle had died down, and even the man who had taken out his phone to film seemed frozen, as if hypnotized by the music. Aisha was no longer aware of the world around her. She played with the strength of a woman who knew that she was seen, and that it was no longer possible to erase her. The melody wrapped around her fingers like a caress, a release, a muffled cry against those who had despised it. Music was her cry, her rebellion, her refusal to be reduced to what was expected of her. Mark, who had initially believed that the situation was going to play out on his terms, began to feel a strange pressure deep in his stomach, as if each note of the piano piece was a blow to the soul. He had waited for this woman, this waitress, to comply with his expectations, for her to collapse under the mockery and shame he had inflicted on her. But that was not what was happening. On the contrary, as the first notes weaved, he felt his own posture waver. The music pumping through the room didn't just fill the space. She penetrated his thoughts, swept away his arrogance and his feeling of superiority. The intensity of the piece that Aisha played, with its emotional richness and depth, was like a revelation. Mark had expected to see a self-effacing, submissive woman, but instead, he was confronted with raw and unalterable strength. She didn't just respond to his challenge, she transcends him.
De minute stretchton, lon, like passi troganoter dimension.
The room seemed to dissolve into the music, each vibration of the air caused by the piano keys becoming a wave that shook the certainties of each person present. Eyes turned, the murmurs died down. Aisha, through each note, erased the invisible boundaries that had always kept her in a subordinate role. No one in the room saw her as a waitress anymore. She was no longer this erased silhouette, frozen within the narrow framework of her social status. She had become a creator, an artist whose music had the capacity to elevate the spirit beyond the limitations imposed by social norms. Mark became aware of it little by little, as if a veil was lifting before his eyes. Everything he had taken for granted, his power, his authority, his view of others, was cracking under the weight of this implacable truth. Aisha no longer thought of him. She was no longer in the restaurant to prove anything to him. She was expressing herself, asserting herself through an art that she had hidden for a long time, out of fear or out of respect for social expectations. But tonight, music offered her a form of freedom she had never known before. She was no longer simply the black woman, the waitress, the invisible. She was all at once, in the beauty of what she expressed, in the power of the composition she had written. This melody was not only the story of his life, she was the incarnation of it, an act of silent resistance against all those who had defined, reduced, ignored her. As the last notes faded gently from the air, a strange peace filled the room. The silence that followed did not seem awkward, but rather charged with understanding, as if the spectators had all suddenly been confronted with a truth that they had ignored or neglected. Time seemed to stand still, and in this void, everyone, even Mark, could feel the power of the moment. One by one, the customers began to applaud. At first timidly, perhaps embarrassed at not having reacted sooner, then more and more enthusiastically, as if this wave of emotion had removed the chains of conformity from them. In a few moments, the entire space vibrated with new energy, as if the music had purified the atmosphere. Mark remained frozen. His mind was spiraling, unable to connect with his original reality. He had imagined that this moment would be a scene of derision, another act in his theater of power, where he would be the master. But now he was a simple spectator, an absurd figure in his own game. The waitress, the invisible one, had just taken the stage by storm. And he never understood how much he had underestimated the power of dignity. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He tried to get up, to find some semblance of control, but he no longer had authority, no more certainty about what had just happened. He stood slowly, his head bowed, his arrogance and pretension trampled under the weight of the truth he could no longer ignore. Without a word, he walked away, his footsteps echoing in the increasingly empty space of his own vanity. The room continued to vibrate with this new energy, but he was silently collapsing under the weight of reality. Aisha finally stood up from the piano, a slight smile touching her lips, but it was not a smile of victory. It wasn't a smile of revenge. It was a smile of rediscovered dignity, of rediscovered personal strength, a recognition of the person she was, beyond the image that the world had wanted to impose on her. She had played for herself, yes. But that wasn't all. The music she had just played was all the validation she needed. She didn't need the applause to know what she had just accomplished. Freedom, true freedom, was to be who you were, without compromise. Her colleagues surrounded her as she headed toward the back of the room, some shyly congratulating her, others trying to hide the surprise in their eyes. But Aisha knew that the real reward was not in their words. She knew, deep down, that what she had accomplished went beyond this evening. She had made her voice heard, a breath into the world, and it would resonate far louder than anything she had imagined. The rest of the evening passed without further incident. But Aisha felt, deep in her soul, that this moment had changed something in her. Not just in this restaurant, not just in front of Mark. She was another person, stronger, more assertive, and she no longer needed any license to exist in her truth. Mark Dufresne, for his part, was just another name among many in the annals of vanity. He would be just a discordant note in a world that now knew the true power of a free soul. And Aisha, the former waitress, had transcended it. In everyone's eyes, she was no longer a simple waitress. She was an artist, recognized in her own right, able to stand in the light without having to seek the approval of others.